As we've just heard, many of the wounds of the Marikana massacre have not yet healed. Those who witnessed the violence or heard how their loved ones were killed still live with the trauma of that day. And to discuss the impact of this, we're joined now by clinical psychologist Kosi Giane in studio. Thanks very much for coming in.
Great, Michelle.
I mean, what an incredible way to explain how they feel, these young people talking about the past being dark, the future being bleak. It's heartbreaking.
No, absolutely. I think this bears testimony to the fact that there are lives that need to continue long after the media and the cameras have moved on to other stories, and that these experiences have consequences that continue to reverberate deep into the lives of not only the people who were affected physically, in the people that they're talking about who were shot, who were at the center of the violence that was happening, but that there's a litany of consequences for people beyond that. So there is not just primary direct trauma, but there's also secondary and indirect trauma of the people who were in the circumstance, even though not physically present in the danger zone, as it were.
I mean, it's so interesting when we think about what makes us angry as a country and when we decide to demand justice. It does appear that we are choosy. There are some people for whom justice is a given, and for others, as we've seen in Marikana, it's yet to come 7 years later.
Yeah, and despite the high price that has already been paid in terms of the lives lost and lives wrecked and futures that have been dimmed, and it still has not happened. And so the trauma continues. So on the one hand, it's very easy to talk from a post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of what they experience. They talk about flashbacks and images and the re-traumatization that continues, because of course the question is, how do they begin to piece their lives together?
I want you to talk to us about what that does for a child, a teenager who's, say, lost their father in such a violent way. How do they come to terms with that trauma? But then also, you know, we've spoken to widows, sisters of these men who were killed, who describe very matter-of-factly that, you know, my husband was shot 10 times in the back, in the groin, in the foot. It's as if they're just describing something day to day, and yet it's this incredibly traumatic event.
Yeah. You know, I think for children particularly, it's very hard to make sense of what was going on and yet have to bear the consequences thereof. And the mind is such a powerful weapon in terms of both the resilience factor in being able to just, you know, live on despite the experience on the one hand, and yet internally the mind also continues to be affected by that experience in manner that people that don't ordinarily appreciate that impact are not able to appreciate how deeply those lives are scarred, and how just the developmental journey of those children is changed, you know, and for life, as it were. You know, and as you say, the adults, the sisters and the wives speak about it in a matter-of-fact way. It is just the numbness of it all, the helplessness of it all. And we heard through all the interviews, there's a sense of hopelessness about not just from the experience, but what it means for the lives of that community altogether. There is no sense that anything better is going to come out of that experience, or that life had been any better. And the hope of it, you know, in terms of the demands that were being made, to be able to just uplift their quality of lives, it's not going to happen. It's not.
And one gets the sense that it's not just the mothers and the children, those generations, it's going to be generations to come.
It is transgenerational.
If there was justice, if we had seen someone held accountable, if we had seen lives changed in Marikana in the wake of what happened, would that help with the trauma?
It would mitigate the trauma, it would, but there also needs to be very direct and psychological intervention, even regardless of whatever else happens. So it is just part of it's not just a once-off type of intervention that is needed. It's a whole community intervention, it's family intervention, it's individual intervention. It's throughout those levels of the ecosystem of those people.
So where we've failed, where government, where the mining companies, where police have failed these communities in terms of reparations, they failed in many other ways as well.
Psychological reparation, emotional reparation, not just, you know, concrete material reparations.
All right, well, thanks very much for coming into studio and giving us that analysis of just the psychological impact on the victims' families and the generations to come as well.